Let's talk supply chain. Welcome to the show, Evan.
Thank you for having me.
I am so excited to have you here. When I was doing my research for the show, I was, fascinated. I already think we're going to have to get you back on the show because I have so many questions and we're not going to have time to fit them all in. I mean, the scope of your solution is so exciting, from finding banned Russian steel shipments to investigating illegal fentanyl networks. I mean, I've never seen anything like this before, never had anything like this before on the show. And I don't want to leave everybody in too much anticipation. So let's dive right in and let's start talking about you. I mean, you have an incredible passion. Where did that come from? And how has that driven the career journey that led you to co-found Altana?
Well, so it starts early. I grew up in a small fishing town in Alaska called Homer. And
Okay.
I know you're Canadian. I should have mentioned we're Arctic neighbors. So in Homer, Alaska, I was kind of a weird kid. I was focused on big global issues. I actually wrote my high school senior thesis back in 2003 on the pending collapse of globalization. So I was right, but I was early. So yeah, just really curious about how the world worked, really focused on big macro things and very driven, academically and professionally. I worked in a fish processing plant all summer from 15 through, actually going into the real workforce. And in Alaska, everybody works in the summertime, and that's when you make your money. So it's all hours of the day. And we would do, 6, 7 days a week, all summer long,
Wow.
12 to 20-hour days. And, you can't go home till the fish is in the freezer. So I found like a lot of meaning and exhilaration in working that way. I was a teenager and they put me in charge of the front of the office, all that kind of
What?
paperwork, the money, the operations of the fish plant. So, as a teenager, kind of running 80, 90 person organization with
Wow.
that much responsibility. So, it was exhilarating. I found a lot of meaning in that. And then when I left Homer to go to college, my world continued to open up. So Bill Clinton came and gave a speech that I won a lottery ticket to with my co-founder, Peter, now. So this was,
Okay.
20 years ago. I won a lottery ticket to go see Bill Clinton give a speech on globalization and the challenges and opportunities of a globalized world. And so there's
Mhm.
like 200 of us in a lecture hall, and Bill Clinton's, going off the cuff. And yeah, it completely changed my world. It motivated me to go dive into development economics, macroeconomics, environmental studies. And my kind of first professional love was renewable energy.
Okay.
So, I like these really big macro systems problems where you can pull a geopolitical lever on the world, an economic lever, a social impact lever. One of the most interesting problems I've ever found is, how do you decarbonize the world's energy supply?
Mhm.
It's like, it's just one big systems problem. So I spent about 7 years of my career in that space. I went to work for a startup right out of college. I then started my own startup when I was 23
Of course you did.
in that space. And then I've kind of been an entrepreneur working on these big, like, renewable energy, supply chain, big earth scale physical systems problems. That's kind of the through line for everything.
That is awesome. I'm surprised it took you to 23 to start your own business. If you were already managing teams of 90 when you were like 15 or 16, you and I have similarities to our stories because I started working when I was 14 years old. Very different, though. I was
Wow.
not in charge of 90 people, but it really instills that work ethic.
Yeah.
Right? Like it really gets you going and understanding the economics of a business and what goes into the business, the logistics of a business. And yeah, I really feel like it instilled that work ethic, but also that curiosity as to
Yep.
I'm doing this now, but what else? What are the other opportunities? What are the things that we can do even better? So I love that. Now, your mission is to fix globalization. So talk to me about that. What has gone wrong with globalization? What are some of the challenges and the risks, and why does it need fixing?
Well, it needs fixing because the side effects and the unintended consequences of globalization have resulted in its demise. So the way to think about that is, we outsource the world, right? And we financialize the world. So we became one big interconnected, interdependent, extremely opaque web of supply chain and financial relationships, right?
Yeah.
And that did a lot of really good things. It lifted billions of people out of poverty. It, was more peace creating than not. But it did some unintended things which really have come home to roost. So one of those is around the geopolitical competition that's now playing out in the world
Hmm.
supply chain.
Yep.
So, we admitted China into the World Trade Organization, and the expectation was that, liberal trade, liberal, financial exchange would result in the Chinese playing by the rules of that international order,
Hmm.
right? So they become more democratic, more capitalistic over time. And, that just didn't happen, right? So for 20 years, when the West was sort of asleep at the wheel, China was engaged in anti-market, industrial policy, anti-competitive industrial policy, very explicitly seeking to gain supply chain advantage, which they've now created, right? So
Hmm.
some of the world's most important supply chains and value chains run through
Hmm.
China, and that
They
dependency
do.
is something that the world's trying to reconcile. So that's thing one, is the sort of geopolitical consequences of an unbridled globalization. The second thing is the environmental and social impacts
Hmm.
of that globalization, right? So these supply chains, the whole economic theory is comparative advantage and cost efficiency. So you want to go to the cheapest, most efficient place to
Hmm.
produce. And almost always that means these externalities around labor and carbon and environmental pollution are going to go up, not down, right?
Right.
And so we're now in a place where, over the course of this century, the consequences of climate change are, multi-trillion dollar, economic impacts, mass migrations, strains on the social infrastructure of migrating countries, or the countries receiving that migration, these big generational shifts associated with that climate dislocation. And then, the world is now reckoning with the fact of forced labor in all these supply chains. And that's a
Yep.
big use case for us at Altana, which I'm sure we'll talk about. So if it all goes out into the dark and into the opaque, can't actually reach into the value chain and see how the goods are made at the raw material origin or at the
Hmm.
base component, that can disguise a lot of very bad labor practices.
Hmm.
So that's thing two, is these environmental and social side effects. And then the third thing that really was revealed through COVID was that an outsourced just-in-time supply chain is only actually efficient when things are stable,
Yes, and we saw
right?
that just a few years ago. Hmm.
Right. So economic efficiency is only under stable conditions. And so those big, dislocations, and my point of view is those dislocations are going to increase, not decrease, over the
Hmm.
course of the coming decades. So that means that there needs to be a reordering of those supply chain networks,
Yeah.
right, to make them more resilient, to make them more transparent and coordinated. It can't just
Yeah.
be, outsourced buyer-supplier relationships coordinating their activity merely through a price mechanism. So that's
Right.
kind of the state of affairs today. So we're now, I think, as a society, and as industrial policy, trade policy, economic security policy, all
Hmm.
kind of focus on these supply chain issues. We're now in, I think, a wave of government action and, to some extent, private sector response that's having to reconcile with all three of those major dislocations.
Well, and it's interesting that you talk about this. I literally just had a conversation the other day with somebody who is fighting against that forced labor in supply chains, and they're
Mm.
going to be coming on Thoughts and Coffee to be talking a little bit more about the action that they are taking. And she was saying that they actually got all of the brands together for Uzbekistan and forced the government to create some regulation around forced labor, and it's, very interesting around who is pulling the strings in different places and how we can get them to turn that around so that we can create that difference and make an impact. And, also, you're right, that supplier management. I mean, these regulations are coming through every day. And it's one of the reasons why they're going to be coming on Thoughts and Coffee, is to talk about what those regulations actually mean. And if you are not ready for it, you might not have a customer anymore, because Apple has, taken out 14 of their suppliers just recently because they won't do audits for sustainability and all this kind of stuff. And if you're not ready for it, they are stopping shipments from coming into the US for that specific reason. So, these are all very, very real challenges that you are talking about and outlining for us. And this is a super important topic that we're talking about today. So I'm so glad that you are coming or that you are on the show. So, how are you working towards that? Like, who is Altana? What do you do? How are you working towards your vision of better global commerce? And it looks like you're the world's first value chain management system. So, tell us what all of that means.
Yeah, so let's start with what is a value chain? For any given product, like an iPhone, it's the connection of production from the raw materials, so the
Hmm.
graphite, the cobalt, the nickel, all the way through the intermediate components as it's assembled through the value chain. So, semiconductors, antennas, glass, through the
Hmm.
final assembly. And then it's actually customer facing too. So you sell this product and here's the chain of distribution and customer use. And then it's the financing and logistics providers to that whole chain. So that's what a value chain is. It's a, for a product, what's that whole global system of production? We are a first of kind solution for revealing and actually taking command of those multi-tier value chain networks.
Okay.
So how do we do that? We had to create a common operating picture for this whole global supply chain network, right?
Hmm.
So if you're sending surveys out, it doesn't really do the trick. If you're just crunching publicly available data and giving everybody little data artifacts, that's not enough. What you really need to take command of these value chain networks is a shared source of truth that connects the parties to those value chains inside of a common operating picture.
Okay.
So 5.5 years ago, when we started Altana, we were coming off of a sale of a company that was a supply chain data provider. So we're like supply chain data and AI geeks is the way to think about it. We said we need to create a Google Maps for the world's supply chain. There needs
Okay.
to be a common operating picture that everybody taps into. And the key is you can only get so far with publicly available data
Yep.
or commercially purchasable data.
Hmm.
And so to do what I just said, you have to somehow unlock access to non-public data. And you have to do that at a massive scale.
Hmm.
So the founding vision for Altana and the technical vision for Altana was that we could connect the world's publicly available data and then non-public data from stakeholders to this shared platform into an AI system that renders a living, breathing map of the world across both the publicly available and non-public private data sets.
Yep.
So that's what we did. And over the last 5.5 years, we've built this hub and spoke federated data network that solves for the data sovereignty, data security, data privacy restrictions that prevent the pooling of all this data, right? Like governments, logistics providers, insurance companies, right? They're not going to like give some
No.
startup all their data, right?
Yeah.
So we bring the platform to their data in these isolated, federated deployments and not the other way around. So rather than data pooling, we meet the data where it is. We
Okay.
learn from that data and we render this, bottoms up view of these value chain linkages. We think we cover, it's hard to know what the denominator is, but we think we cover roughly half of all the supply chain linkages in the world
Wow.
down to the facility and part level.
Okay.
So this location operated by this company, moving these parts, these products to this location operated by this other company, and you kind of see that whole web of production. That's what we did over the last 5 years. We're now in a place where that Google Maps of the supply chain, that living, breathing, bottoms up model is growing tremendously. It's being fed by the data and learnings of our customer network, which
Hmm.
include the largest retailers, brands, logistics providers, financial service providers. And we're now at the place where roughly half of all that supply chain visibility, the
Hmm.
value chain visibility is coming from the first party customer network. We've exhausted what's gettable out in the open
Uh-huh.
source and kind of
Yep.
scrapable off the internet. And we've now doubled that. And that continues to compound and grow as more and more organizations join the platform. That's the necessary ingredient to actually reveal and start to take action on these value chain networks. So then how do you then take action? And
Yeah.
that's what we mean by a value chain management system. What we allow our customers to do is to situate themselves, their products, their suppliers, their customers, their shipments inside of this global network and see the multi-tier, supplier, supplier, supplier,
Yep.
customers, customer, customer, see those networks in real time. And then overlay lenses for different jobs to be done. So think about, a lot of these are being driven by government regulation. So there's a lot of compliance use cases here. You talked
Mhm.
about forced labor. That's a big
Yep.
one, right? The
Mhm.
the US government, now the EU government, the UK government are banning the import of goods that have any amount of forced labor upstream in their value chain.
Right.
And those are multi-$100 million and even billion-dollar detentions that are happening at the border.
Yep.
So forced labor is one lens. Carbon is another. So we have the ability to situate all this scope 3 carbon emissions data on top of the value chain network for these
Hmm.
different, carbon accounting and reporting and carbon tariff workflows. There's also lenses around things like spend, right? So if you're a procurement leader, you want to know not just your direct spend across the suppliers you engage with today, but
Yep.
you want to understand the indirect spend that you have through these value chain networks. So
Hmm.
some of our customers are modeling the combined direct and indirect spend so that they can go have, much more effective negotiations, right? Hey,
Yep.
I buy, a $500 million of goods from you directly, but also indirectly, the tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, I've got another $1 billion of spend with you. So I want to
Right.
coordinate and consolidate that
Hmm.
purchasing power, right? And then we're going to have a different negotiation. Some of the lenses that you put on the value chain are around business interruption. So we talked about resilience and all the COVID shocks. And we're in a place now where we can actually model not just the risk of something happening, hey, an event happened here, and here's how it's going to
Right.
percolate through a value chain and hit you 6 months from now. But we're also in a place where we can start to quantify in dollar terms the revenue at risk, like the economic impact of that kind of, choke
Hmm.
point or, adverse event happening in the supply chain. So what product families at what facilities with what revenue tied to them? And then how do I put a dollar figure associated with this insight?
Well, and it's interesting because I always talk about where are you going to spend your risk dollars. So I've always used
Yeah.
that term over the last, I don't know, year, 18 months. And it's funny that you're now coming on the show and actually showcasing that sort of term that I've been using quantifiably into how you actually get that data and how you actually figure out where your risk dollars are being spent.
Yeah. What you find talking to customers who buy like supply chain risk management tools
Yeah.
is that a risk score is pretty useless
Okay.
because there's no context, right? So how do
Mhm.
I contextualize this red light
But
to
they're all always thinking about their bottom line too, right? So it
that's what I
has
mean
to
by
be
context, right?
quantifiable in dollars.
Right.
Yeah.
So okay, there's a risk score. How does it connect to me?
Hmm.
How does it connect to specific product families and their value chains?
Yeah.
Then how does that associate to the revenue impact of the thing
Hmm.
I'm looking at, right? So that's what I mean by context.
Yeah.
If it's just a risk score and you got to go figure out what it actually means, it's not very useful.
Right. What does it mean to me? Why should I care?
Exactly.
You know what I mean? I love that. I love that. So you work with an incredible range of customers. You just mentioned it, but from Maersk to U.S. Custom and Border Protection. So do you
Yeah.
have an ideal client? Like who's going to benefit from partnering with you the most?
The blessing and the curse of Altana is that we can do so much for so many constituents. So as a still small startup, we're just under 200 people. We're always under strain to, you know, not bite off more than we can chew. So we work with governments. We help to enforce the law. We help them to protect national security, and we help them to facilitate trade. So, customs authorities, border management, law enforcement, national security agencies, creating resilient and secure defense industrial base supply chains, that kind of
Mhm.
thing. We work with enterprises directly. So our buyers there are typically, a head of supply chain or, supply chain procurement, or a head of sustainability
Okay.
or a head of compliance, or often all three.
All three. I was
Yeah.
gonna say, I almost feel like you go into a meeting with one and explain it, and then you have to do it another two times because they're like, wait a second, this
That's right.
person needs to be in this meeting too.
Right. So, the positioning is we're helping you to create a source of truth for your value chains for the
Hmm.
first time, right? So it's not just like outside in data. Our platform allows the user to go in and actually edit and document and verify and curate the value chain networks to actually create a source of truth, right? Like this is a living, breathing information substrate for these different value chain management jobs to be done.
Yeah.
So that's what I mean. So, step one is we unify all your data, we clean it, we deduplicate it, and then we give you the tools to go document it, verify it,
Mhm.
actually reach into your suppliers or reach across your customers, and then gather that information that creates a source of truth. On top of that, you then have these multiple, modules, like lenses on the map is the way to think about it, that support those different use cases: compliance, sustainability, procurement,
Right.
resilience. And then we have workflows that keep you in the product to actually do something, right? So that's another difference between supply chain risk management or some of these compliance tools. And what we do is we actually give you the tooling to collaborate with your supply chain team, your legal team, your finance team, your sustainability team, all in one common operating picture, and then reach into your value chain network to actually act on the visibility and the decision support that the system's providing you. So how do you take action, like with reports? How do you
Yeah.
gather information for a regulatory attestation you have to make? How do you triage across these different stakeholders? How do
Yeah.
you qualify a supplier? So those are like workflows that actually keep the customer in product, and that's why we call it a value chain management system.
That absolutely makes sense. And especially with all of this regulatory that's coming down in regards to, like we said, forced labor, the raw materials itself. Like how far upstream do you really understand your supply chain or your value chain? What does that
Mm-hmm.
look like? How much do you know? Because you really need to have those insights to be able to do business
Yeah.
in 2024 and beyond. And so it's really, really important that companies work with, platforms like yours to be able to understand that and have the right data, because it's not just about collaborating internally, right?
Correct.
It's like when that happens, when the government comes to you and says, who actually made this for you? And do you know what went into it? And you go, oh, I'm going to need some time to figure that out. Think
Yeah.
about the capital costs that are sitting there in that product that are not able to be sold or delivered, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. Like this, and they are cracking down. Like we're talking millions and millions of products on a yearly basis that I don't think we talk enough about, that people really understand this is our reality today.
So you're absolutely right. And one of the really unique features of this value chain management system we've built, back to the beginning, we've done this on a federated but common operating picture for all of
Okay.
the stakeholders that we connect into the platform.
Hmm.
So why does that matter in the context of all this regulation that
Hmm.
you just cited? Well, we're working with US Customs and Border Protection. We're
Right.
working with the UK government. We're working with, I guess this is public now, the EU. We're working in Australia, right? So we're
Okay.
helping, they're using our map of the world, they're using our value chain management
Hmm.
system to actually enforce these laws.
And as a trusted source of truth.
The theory of our business is that we can actually facilitate public-private partnership and new
Hmm.
ways of working, right? So, not just be sticks, but like what are the carrots you can introduce
Hmm.
for these trusted value chain networks? And how do you get everybody into a common operating picture, doing trusted trade, building
Yeah.
trusted global value chains? So that's
Love
the
that.
big idea here. And so if you connect to Altana, then you're connecting to the platform trusted by these governments to
Yeah.
enforce these trade and economic security and climate
Hmm.
policies that are really driving a lot of this
Yeah.
refactoring.
It's almost like known travelers,
That's
right?
a
Like
very,
Nexus
very,
and
yeah.
right? That's what you're building, the Nexus for supply chain. And I don't know if everybody is familiar with Nexus. I think it's also
That's
called
a
Global
Canadian
Entry.
US traveler, yeah, trusted traveler. But yeah, so for the American listeners, the analogy would be Clear for cargo. You go through the
Okay.
airport, and that company Clear is your kind of fast pass through
Yeah.
security. We're building that for supply chains.
I love that. So let's talk about visibility, because you're talking about how you're achieving incredible levels of visibility. Visibility is kind of that word of the day in supply chain. It's been overused a little bit, but you say that you deliver more than twice the supply chain visibility of any other provider. Now, that's amazing and really an incredible competitive advantage for you, but also your customers. So, how
Yeah.
does that translate for an organization looking to use your platform? Because sometimes organizations can be a little bit overwhelmed by data, right?
Hmm.
They have visibility, but they don't know what to do with it. Plus, I find that, the word visibility means different things to different people.
Yeah. Well,
So,
just to nerd out for a little bit, in the history of supply chain and logistics technology, visibility has gone through three phases.
Yeah.
So in the beginning, visibility was really focused on what do I have in the warehouse? What do I have, in inventory and sort of goods in process? So basically, where's my stuff? How much is it worth? Where in the world is it?
Yeah.
As you sort of
Hmm.
distribute and allocate inventory. And then the second wave of visibility was around logistics visibility.
Hmm.
So where's my stuff in transit? So the factory made it. Now I want to trace the movement of the goods through, ocean, air,
Hmm.
truck, warehouse, and see that whole chain. So that's much more like real time. Where's my item? And then the third wave here, and this is what Altana does, is provide visibility on the supply chain, or think about it as the value chain networks themselves.
Okay.
So it's that bottoms up view for a given product. Where do the raw materials come from? At which factory or farm
Hmm.
or mine, right? And then how do I trace the movement of goods from facility to facility as it gets into a finished product and then
Hmm.
is sold to customers? So that's the kind of visibility that we bring. And then to your question of so what do you do with it? Well, you're right that much visibility is literally overwhelming, and there's nobody in a company whose job is value chain manager.
Okay. That is very true. There's no title
Right.
of that yet, I don't think. And if
Right.
anybody
So
has one, I want you to reach out to me because Evan and I want to know.
oh yeah, I want to show you our product. Reach out. So the concept of needing to manage an entire value chain, with
Hmm.
some exceptions in pharmaceuticals and a couple of highly regulated industries, it's never been a thing, right? Because of outsourcing.
Right.
Right? That was the whole point. Like I'm going to only concern myself with my suppliers and my customers, and that's my worldview. And SAP and Coupa and Oracle don't even have the concept of a tier two supplier in their data model.
Okay.
Like these like operating systems for business don't even give you the concept of a value chain to
Hmm.
model and operate on and do something about. So that's where we come in. So we're providing all this visibility beyond your direct tier one customers or
Hmm.
suppliers, and then that, as you said, is overwhelming. And so you really need to help them focus. So we describe our product, what's a value chain management system? It helps you see all your value chains in one place. It's a real source of truth. Focus on different business priorities within all that visibility, and then act, see, focus, act.
Okay.
So when we talk about focus, it's using artificial intelligence, it's using analytics, it's using event monitoring and alerting to really focus you on the
Hmm.
things that matter across that whole multi-tier network. And again, that's going to span everything from compliance to sustainability to spend to inventory
Hmm.
to real-time events, and then to act. So you can't just kind of see things and receive an analytic and then not do anything
You
about
got
it,
to
right?
do something with
Yeah,
it.
how do
I
you do something
like
about
this
it?
act part because I'm very much about action items and people being able to utilize it.
And this is why collaboration is so key. And I notice behind you, you say collaboration is the future of business
I do. I've been saying
on your
this for
shelf.
years. I think since I started in 2018.
Well, you and I totally agree. So the whole orientation of ACT in Altana is
Hmm.
collaboration. So what are the collaborative workflows that allow people to make decisions and take action based on what they're seeing?
Hmm.
And so, that's going to be around triaging. It's around supplier management and qualification. A lot of this is ending in reporting and documentation.
Yeah.
Right. I need to go reach into the value chain, retrieve these documents to build up a regulatory attestation for
Hmm.
an EU thing. And so our whole, theory of the business is that through collaboration across silos, we can enable trusted value chains.
Yeah.
And those silos, aren't just within an organization, right? It's
Hmm.
silos across organizations.
Yeah.
Supplier, the enterprise and its logistics provider, the
Hmm.
enterprise and its insurance broker and carrier, the enterprise and the regulator. So we're connecting all these parties into one collaborative, common operating picture on the dimension of these multi-tier value chains and giving them the tools to actually connect and operate with each other and take action.
And make better decisions. I really like that. Now, you mentioned AI because I think all of this is driven by AI. So, what does your AI do? And what's your take on how it's used and views across the industry right now? Because, I said visibility is kind of that, word that everybody has been using. But AI is also now another word that I don't think you can go one day without hearing all sorts of things about. So talk to us about that.
We were a supply chain AI company before it was cool to be a supply chain startup and before it was cool to be an answer. So we've got it in our DNA. We use artificial intelligence to render that bottoms up view of the world across
Mhm.
billions of data points. So if you think about,
I mean, you kind of have to when you talk about that many data points
yeah,
and
this is
how
a
many
thing that humans
people,
literally couldn't do,
yeah,
right?
how many people you're bringing together. I mean, you have to use AI to be able to make sense of it. And bring it to a point where people can
Uh,
act, which is what you just said.
yeah, so if you think about the underlying raw data that we that we access across this whole federated data network, it's everything from, a bill of lading to a cargo manifest to a purchase order
So
to
much
bills of
paper.
materials to shipping instructions, right? So and anybody that's been in the, trade, supply chain, logistics space knows that this is messy stuff.
Yep.
And it's not just in English, right? It's in Chinese and Spanish and Russian and
Broken
Arabic.
English.
And the goods description has, call Sarah Barnes Humphrey at the port, and at this address, you got to extract all the
Yep.
text from the, raw records and
hmm
figure out what it all means. So the only way to chew through that much data and then create, a map of the world is through artificial intelligence.
hmm
So we built our own system to do that. That was kind of the founding R&D journey of the company. Across this federated data platform, how do you crunch all these different data sets and then render this bottoms up view of the world? So that's step one. And then we use the same AI systems to fuse in customer data
hmm
and then map out their value chains. So if you think about, a big spider web of billions of connections, what you don't want to do is tell, this is a real example with one of our competitors, a big global brand that has among other things, they have chocolate products.
Okay.
And, another company that's just kind of randomly crunching publicly available data and scraping the internet told them that they had 6,000 tier three chocolate suppliers.
Okay.
And that's too many.
Way too
Not
many.
there's
Like that's
probably
a
not that many
lot.
chocolate suppliers on earth, but so then they get into it, and KPMG was one of them, Microsoft was one of them. So it's like, why is Microsoft a chocolate supplier to me? So the point is, if you're just drawing random connections across all this global data, which everybody else is, then you're not going to get to
Not
actual
accurate.
clarity and accuracy on the
hmm
value chain itself. So show me what things and which factories and which suppliers go into my actual product,
Yeah.
right? So that whole step that I just described, that's an AI workflow where our customers actually, as they go in and they edit and they verify and they document that source of truth for each of their value chains,
hmm
the AI is learning from all those expert interactions. So that's
hmm
called active learning or reinforcement learning with human feedback. So then now I've got the customer data situated in the world, and I've used AI to do that.
hmm
And now we need to actually generate some insight, or we need to automate some tasks. So we have systems that do everything from automating the assignment of customs codes, like
hmm
HS codes, where you assign duties and do all your cross-border compliance. So we do that natively in the product catalog for each of these value chains. So what are the HS codes? What should they be for every jurisdiction? We use AI to identify and quantify those business interruption risks that we talked about
hmm
earlier. We use AI to model out point source carbon emissions data to summarize that and to roll it up into a scope 3 carbon emissions estimate. And I can keep going. So you use
That's a,
AI
that's a
to
big one right now, right? Like,
big deal.
a lot of people are looking at, all of these goals for 2020, 2030, which
Yep.
really is only 5 years from now. And it's not just about the reporting, but it's how are we going to get there?
Yeah.
What
What's
does
the
that look like?
decarbonization pathway? Right.
Yeah, what do we need to do? You need the data. You need AI to be able to help you figure out what that pathway is going to look like to
You,
achieve those
you need
goals.
you need one more thing. You need the connectivity through the value chain to
Yes.
coordinate and collaborate and work together to achieve those outcomes, whether it's
Well,
a compliance thing or a carbon thing. You have to
yeah.
actually be able to reach into the network beyond your direct supplier
Yeah.
to verify it, to collaborate, to coordinate around it.
Well, and also see who's not going to play ball.
Totally.
Right? I mean, let's face it. They're, like I just said with Apple, they're getting rid of, they don't want to. That's a last resort for them. But if you won't go through an audit and you won't help them achieve those goals and you won't implement the technology or the platforms to be able to do that, you're gonna lose some business and people don't want to do that. So we really need to be talking about this right now. Now, I want you to paint a picture for me. I want to get into the case study part because I
Yeah.
really want the audience to get a sense of what that could mean for them and their organization. So paint me a picture. What was the challenge that one of your customers came to you with? What was, I mean, obviously the solution is your platform. If there was a specific part of the platform that helped the most, let's talk about that. And then what was the ROI and benefit to them from working with Altana?
Well, there's a bunch, but I'll keep it mostly enterprise centric, maybe do
Sure.
some logistics. So on the enterprise, we have a lot of customers using us today for these different compliance obligations.
Okay.
So it's not just forced labor, but it's the EU deforestation regulation, the
Okay.
EU carbon border adjustment
Hmm.
mechanism, the EU CSRD. So I can keep going, but there's about nine of them.
Wow. A
And so
lot to
these are
keep up
all,
with.
yeah, it's all some version of thou shalt know and report on and be accountable for what's happening across your value chains and not just what you do directly.
Right.
So, we, I won't name names, but, the iconic global apparel brand,
Hmm.
one of our customers. And we started working with them about 18 months ago, where, they had hundreds of millions of dollars of imports
Hmm.
detained by US Customs and Border Protection for
Wow.
the suspected link to forced labor in Xinjiang, China. So, that's a big deal. It's a multi-hundred-million-dollar impact, not to mention a major reputation and kind of legal impact. It could impact their trusted trader status under CTPAT. So they came to us, and the first step was just helping them get their arms around the size and pinpoint the problems. It turned out that roughly a third of all their value chains had some upstream connection to Xinjiang.
Yeesh. And they had
Yeesh.
no idea.
No.
Wow.
And these are like, very well-meaning good actors, right? This wasn't
Yeah,
like
yeah,
a
yeah. No, no. I mean, at the end of the day, all of this, most everybody's going to go into it with good intentions
right.
and do everything that they possibly can to figure it out, or at least keep an eye on it and know what they're doing. But there's only so much you can do.
Totally. Totally. So step one was just help them see the problem, get the
Yeah,
visibility,
figure
pinpoint
that
the
out.
connections to Xinjiang. And then what's happened since then is they've, triaged their way through those, right? Like what are the things we can immediately just cut out, tell our supplier to stop working with, discontinue this relationship, document it. But a cooler thing has happened where, in order to take action
Mhm.
on that visibility, the stakeholders in the compliance and sustainability teams of this enterprise needed to go to the supplier managers under procurement, and they had to collaborate.
Collaboration. I love it.
So, okay, now I've got to go to the supply chain team, and
Yeah.
you can imagine what those first conversations were like. What is this? How do I believe it? And the power of our platform is that we're actually showing them their own data, their own products, SKU numbers, part numbers,
Right.
styles, colorways in their own language, all in one place. So, here's all your SKUs, here's all your styles, here's their value chains in a verifiable format, right? And so what that did was it gained the trust of the procurement team that it was, real data, real
That's a tough
visibility.
one.
Right, right. And then, all these kind of like risk and sustainability analytics things outside in, how does this actually relevant to me? This isn't my world.
Right.
This fragmented data. So that's really different. So then, what we heard from the supply chain and sort of supplier manager groups is this is the best view of our own suppliers and products that we've ever seen in one place, one sort of integrated, interoperable, combined knowledge base.
Right.
And we have their colorways, their styles, we have the factories at each of these things. We show the ownership and other connections of those factories and companies all the way through the value chain. We situate supplier surveys that they've done on top of that network, right? You've already done a lot of work. How do we integrate all of that into one kind of shared view? And so it becomes a source of truth now to have the conversations between procurement, sustainability, legal and compliance, right? And now their global trade management team has come in and they're doing more cross-border use cases. So then the even cooler thing is they had to, in order to really action this stuff, they had to go outside their four walls and they
Hmm.
had to reach into their suppliers.
Yep.
And so what's been happening is their suppliers are coming on our platform in order to have a shared view of the world and in order to work together on these. It started around compliance, but now it's expanding around to more sort of run-of-the-mill supplier management,
Hmm.
coordination, qualification kinds of use cases. And so we've not only kind of spread across the organization, we've reached out through their value chains. They've referred us to some of their biggest retail customers because they want to
Amazing.
have a common operating picture with them. And now they're using us upstream in their whole business process. So before we figure out what to make or who to buy from, let's design the value chain. Let's model it theoretically and see if we can get ahead of these things and build kind of rules-based, trusted value chains before we actually inherit them from a tier one supplier. So that's all to say that the impact in dollar terms is hundreds of millions of dollars of avoided penalties. So they've been able to like literally push print in our platform and provide that as a attestation, a sort of admissibility package to US
Hmm.
Customs. And that's helped them to get these goods released to avoid future detentions. So that's a major brand liability and just multi-$100 million business impact. And
Amazing.
then the thing it's unlocking, and the reason I went through that whole kind of evolution of the workflow is collaboration along the dimension of value chains, both within and across the organizations that they're connected to. So that's been the really inspiring thing is like they're actually, developing the ways of working to manage value chains and not just buyer supplier relationships.
Amazing. I love that story because it really shows, like you said, we keep using the word collaboration, but it's so true. How do we bring everybody together? How do we bring those suppliers in? And like you said, if you can print something to give to CBP, it's not just those millions of dollars. It's that capital cost within that product that could be sitting there for months because you don't have that printout. Right. And you have to go back through and you have to ask all the questions and all the manual phone calls and emails and waiting. Nobody wants to go through that. Nobody has time for that anymore. So I love that story that you just shared. Now we have come to our last question, and I just want to know about the future. What does the future hold for Altana? Can you share one thing with us that we can maybe expect to see from you?
This won't surprise you at all. We're betting the company over the next 2 years on collaboration.
Yay.
Yay. So what that means is really, really leaning into these cross-functional and cross-organizational workflows on top of a secure, permissioned kind of supply chain master data layer and hooking up not just multi-tier suppliers or multi-tier customers, but also the service providers to those value chains, insurance, financial, like supply chain finance providers, logistics. And I expect that over that same time frame, we'll be able to do the same thing between the government and the private sector in product.
Amazing. Well, collaboration is not only the future of business, it's the future of supply chain. And I can't wait to have you back on this show because, Evan, I think you and I could talk for so much more because there's so much to really talk about and dive a little bit deeper on. We didn't really get heavily into compliance and sustainability. And I know that Altana is helping with that as well. So until now, it was impossible to know, let alone manage the origin of raw materials, supplier connections, and intermediate processing of goods across the vast physical economy as they make their way to your business. But Altana has changed all of that. Now you can connect Altana to reveal your value chain connections, then verify and document them through the platform to establish your source of truth. With its world's first value chain management system, Altana are building a fairer, more secure, and more sustainable model of global commerce for all of us. Now, you can go and find out more at altana.ai. And did you have a guess at today's big question? Well, at the top of the show, I asked you globally, there are more than 2 billion farms in operation. But how much CO2 do they produce every year? Well, 10 gigatons of CO2 emissions result from growing ingredients and commodities every single year. Just imagine the impact that could be made by reducing those emissions, even by a very small amount. Evan, and to the team at Altana, thank you so much for making this episode happen. And thank you for coming on the show today.
This was awesome, Sarah. Thank you. Really appreciate it.